So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Crimando. I'm a disaster behavioral health specialist working for about the last 31 years in emergency behavioral health. A lot of that time was spent in various local hospitals working in psychiatric emergency, but most of my time has been working in disaster mental health for different state and federal agencies as well as the United Nations. So my work for the last 30 some odd years has been related to assisting people in the wake of all different sorts of crisis events, ranging from natural and technological disasters to public health emergencies. I was a first responder to both the 1993 and 9/11 World Trade Center attacks and ran psychological operations at the Anthrax Screening Center in the fall of 2001. Also part of the Ebola task force, and I've had an opportunity to work on many disease outbreaks over my career, both here in the States and with the United Nations, as I mentioned. So as we get started, know my background is my training as a clinical psychologist, but my work is primarily in a field today that's referred to as operational psychology. And operational psychology is the use of clinical, cognitive, and social psychological ideas for their tactical or their operational value. So I get to work with all sorts of agencies, as I said, state and federal law enforcement agencies. I serve with the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force at Newark Division, work with the National Counterterrorism Center and a number of other national programs like that as well. So it is from a mental health standpoint that really we're going to talk primarily about how we provide support to individuals in our communities and our organizations during something as unique and something as powerful as the current COVID-19 pandemic. The program is broken into 7 sections, varying lengths. They're going to move pretty quickly. In fact, the pace we're moving at already is pretty much the tempo I'm going to keep for the entire program so that we can get through the content. As you'll notice, we're going to come or start the program really with a quick discussion about the unique mental health consequences of public health emergencies in general and pandemics in specific, and then about halfway turn the corner in terms of intervention and what do we do about it in terms of providing support by phone and by the web. And just as we're modeling here in this Zoom meeting today or webinar, obviously the vast majority of contact we're having with the community at this point is through these distance technologies because the nature of a disease outbreak is for us to have to distance from each other. And we'll talk about ways we kind of manage some of the mental health consequences of that social distancing, remembering that social distancing does not have to result in social isolation. So we're going to move pretty quickly through the curriculum, as I said, but I do have to start in somewhat of a powerful and a grim place to put things in perspective. Now remember that this is being recorded, so some people may watch this recording months and maybe even years after the fact. So to put it in context, the date today of this program is Monday, April 20th, 2020. As of 7 o'clock this morning, 761,000 people, almost 762,000 in the US have been infected with COVID-19. And that's resulted so far in 40,724 deaths over the past several weeks. Just last week at this time was actually the most deadly day of the pandemic so far. And that was, again, resulted in 2,400 deaths in a single day. COVID worldwide has resulted in more than 2.4 million infections and 166,000 deaths. So to create some perspective for that, and me very often using the 9/11 attack as a point of reference, having been a responder there, on the day of the World Trade Center attack in New York City at Ground Zero, we lost about 2,600 people. At present, for the last several weeks, we're losing roughly between 1,500 and 2,000 people a day. So we're having right now somewhat of a 9/11 event almost every day of the week and may for a little while longer. Pandemics are by their nature slow-moving mass fatality events. Now these are obviously very different than other sorts of disasters and emergencies in which we have these clear bookends in which we know exactly when the event starts and when it stops. Tends to be much more punctuated, and as awful as they are, they have these clear stop and start points. We've seen certainly things in our region in New York City where they've gone to mass graves for unclaimed bodies, where we're using refrigerator trucks to store the excess number or just overwhelming numbers of deceased that have been the result of this infection and this virus so far. So a very, very large scale catastrophic event. But one of the things that is tricky about it from a psychosocial standpoint is the nature that it kind of moves in slow motion. Now, pandemics are by their nature very long emergencies as well. Historically, most pandemics have lasted anywhere between 12 and 18 months. So our program today is not a pandemic 101 sort of program where we're going to spend much time talking about the medical aspects of it or the scientific aspects. We're going to really drill down to the human service, social service level and talk about how we help our program participants, how we help our community, and how we help our staff in dealing with some of the fear, anxiety, and potentially negative behaviors that are associated with an emergency like this. So really the program is in two major components. It's about impact and intervention. And impact, we'll talk about how we're affected, of course, and it's very different than other sorts of emergencies. It's not an event that's characterized primarily by traumatic stress reactions. So I do want to spend some time acquainting you with what kind of behavioral responses we do anticipate. And then, of course, how we assist people, primarily by phone and by internet. Now, in terms of objectives, in disaster mental health in general, our objectives are pretty standard across different sorts of events. And that is, first of all, that our process is largely a psychoeducational process and not a psychotherapeutic process. And when I use that term for this presentation, psychoeducation will always mean the same three things. It will mean helping people understand the normalcy of their reaction, helping people understand strategies and techniques for coping with the reaction, and connecting them to available services and support so they don't have to do that alone. So a lot of what we do in our everyday contacts in terms of mental health support and social service support for folks, we will still be doing in this context. It's just important that if task one is to help people understand the normalcy of their reaction, we have to understand what those normal reactions look like. And this is a very abnormal sort of event. Disease outbreaks in general and pandemics do not necessarily look like other sort of crisis events in terms of the behavioral health response. So the same sort of active listening and supportive listening that you do on a day-to-day basis, the way we provide support and comfort and empathy to people, we're going to continue to do, but now we're having to do it at a distance, and we may have to adjust our response, understanding the unique reactions. One of the things we're always doing in disaster behavioral health is looking for and listening for those instances when someone may be having a more acute or more severe psychiatric emergency that requires immediate referral to a higher level of care. And that would be something like the local screening center. But also remember that there are going to be some situations in which it can seem to you like there's nothing you really can say to help calm or comfort an individual given the severity of their situation. So another core concept in disaster behavioral health is the importance of compassionate presence. And that's just simply being available to people during this very, very difficult time. You might not always have the right thing to say. And here, if you haven't heard this, paraphrasing a quote from Maya Angelou, who had said, people will not necessarily remember what you said, they won't necessarily remember what you did, but they will remember how you made them feel. So we do want to make sure that we're conveying our empathy, our comfort, our concern for folks, letting them know that they're not alone, and trying to sustain our relationships with them during a very, very stressful time. Now, from a call standpoint, as the call taker or someone reaching out by phone or internet to provide support, again, it's very much the same sort of skill set we would use in day-to-day contacts with people. So I'm not going to belabor this slide and read each of the points, but they're primarily active listening skills, which most people will be very familiar with. They're listening for any sort of more acute scenarios that require referral to a higher level of care, as I mentioned. They're offering practical assistance, and I'll talk to you more about what we mean by that in just a few moments. And of course, connecting people with the proper sort of resources as they need them. But in terms of your basic skill sets, from your everyday way of interacting with our customers or consumers or clients, not a lot of changes in terms of the basic skill set. What we'd like the caller to come out of the situation with is, one, this level of support where maybe you are that calm, clear-headed person who is not available to them in their home, their family, or their community during a time that could be so anxious and so overwhelming for them. Now, a lot of the techniques we use later are based on a psychological first aid model. Psychological first aid is different than mental health first aid. Mental health first aid makes the assumption that the person we're assisting has or is developing a diagnosable mental health condition, something, some sort of disorder. Psychological first aid is not making that assumption. It really is addressing people just based on the nature of their reaction to a terrifying, traumatic, or life-threatening sort of hazard or crisis. And there's a number of different skills that we're going to address and modify for that. But in general, psychological first aid is often mentioned or referred to as a model of assisted coping. And what assisted coping means is doing with but not doing for the person. We know disasters and emergencies have a tendency to strip power and control away from people. In every place we can, we want to make a concerted effort to try to return that power and control to people as we can. So we may be a person on the other end of the line or under the computer screen who could help them think through their immediate challenges and prioritize their needs, set some immediate goals, connect to the right sort of resources, or maybe introduce some different skills and techniques like relaxation techniques or different coping strategies to help them get through the immediate challenges. We could also simply be that kind of positive and optimistic voice for them during a time where all the other news they get may seem so dire and so frightening. So this is kind of an assisted coping or system problem solving, but it's a little different perhaps than some of our everyday work because our focus should not necessarily be on solving the person's problem, but more so helping them cope with their emotional reactions so they're in a better position to deal with their own challenges and solve some of their own problems for themselves. Unless you're working in a case management sort of capacity where we have the time and the opportunity to really focus on any one caller or any one consumer in depth, typically our calls and our contacts by phone are fairly brief, supportive contacts, and they're not necessarily meant to be a case management by phone approach. So this may be a shift in terms of what you're doing in your normal role with the agency. But I want to speak a little bit about what's different in terms of the mental health response to a pandemic. First of all, when we look at public health emergencies, and these could be all kinds of disease outbreaks, and they can be other sorts of threats such as contamination or different environmental emergencies either. They're very, very different than other sorts of emergencies, and they are simultaneously medical emergencies and mental health emergencies. People's fear and stress and anxiety obviously has a very profound effect on their physiology and their physical wellness, and obviously their physical condition in the health emergency contributes and plays a great role in their mental health response and their emotional response to the event. What we've learned, whether it's an anthrax or Ebola or other crises, is you really cannot effectively treat one without the other. Just deal with the mental health or just deal with the physical health. This works best when we're able to combine both resources and information about their physical needs and their emotional needs during a crisis like this. Now, SARS is very often used as a reference point right now during this health emergency. But SARS, if you remember that or read somewhat about it, was actually not a pandemic. Pandemics imply that the disease outbreak is global. And right now, the current COVID-19 is on 6 continents, every continent except Antarctica. It is a global event where SARS affected only 29 countries. SARS also resulted in only 8,000 infections and 744 casualties. So in this way, or fatalities rather, in this way, it was a very, very different event. But SARS in Hong Kong, SARS in Toronto resulted in a very, very long behavioral health challenge. We very often say that public health emergencies have a very long tail. And we know the mental health response can be very chronic compared to other sorts of emergencies. If we look at SARS, we also know that nearly half of people surveyed said they had very severe deterioration in their daily mental health functioning. So during the crisis and after the crisis, we know there's going to be significant behavioral health challenges for us to address. In fact, when we look at SARS, some of the researchers there very clearly observed that the psychological contagion actually was much, much more wide and much more far-reaching than actually the physical contagion or medical contagion from the event. Now, you also have to remember that right now, you and I are the first workers ever to have to deal with a pandemic during a social media sort of environment. So the way information spreads today is very, very different than it did in the last pandemics and last public health emergencies. And it raises some different sorts of challenges. Well, social media obviously can be a two-edged sword. It can be used to spread good information, bad information, misinformation, and rumor. But it all happens very, very quickly. We also know, and this is something important to think about, once that information has gone out, it is very hard to unscare people. So we want to make sure information that people are getting is accurate, it's credible, it's timely, and it's not, it's not just ramping up fear irresponsibly. Now, just very quickly in terms of a little discussion of pandemics, pandemics obviously are nothing new, and pandemics have been with us since the beginning of recorded time. There typically are about 3 pandemics a century. Now, most of the pandemics are so mild that they're barely distinguishable from a normal flu season. So if we look in 1957, 58 at the Asian flu was about 1.1 million people lost to that. In the Hong Kong flu, about 1 million 10 years later. When we get to SARS, that was about 770 people, as I said, were killed in that, but it's the closest thing we have as a model right now. COVID right now, we started with the numbers are obviously much, much larger and a much more severe infection. But pandemics, as I said, are not something new. Now, the last great pandemic, a real kind of watershed moment and a real milestone in the research, was the great pandemic of 1918, 1919. You'll also remember that's the exact same time as World War I. So there was a lot of fatalities resulting from the war. But on top of that, what was known as the Spanish flu, we believe resulted in about 40 to 50 million deaths as that really kind of unfolded over about an 18-month period. So that's the last major pandemic of our era. And COVID-19 is not thought to reach those kind of levels. It's a severe pandemic, whereas the Spanish flu was thought to be a very severe pandemic. So as we think about that, what's different between that pandemic and this pandemic? Well, obviously the virus itself was different, but the whole world was different. And just as kind of a starting place, in 1918, the world population was about 1.8 billion people, and it's quadrupled since. We're today at 7.8 billion people and, growing by the moment. The other thing is population distribution. In that time era, people primarily lived in rural and agricultural areas. Today, 4 out of 5 Americans live in urban areas. So there's a lot more people, and those people are a lot more closely packed together. The other thing is intercontinental travel. Back in the day, 1918, it was primarily by steamship, and it took about 2 weeks to get from one continent to the other. Today, obviously, it just takes hours. So the way diseases can move and how fast they can move has all radically changed. And also how we share information, good information, bad information, and rumor has all changed as well. Out of the 7.8 billion people on the planet today, we know just a little more than half, about 4.7 rather, billion or 4.8 billion people have daily access to cellular communication, which means on top of just voice and text, many of them have access to social media platforms and other means of communication as well. And lastly, obviously the medical field has changed radically in that 100 years, mostly for the better, but you'll have to remember that much of the developing country will actually never get to the point during this disease outbreak of having medications, such as antivirals, or having vaccine. In developed countries, such as the US and most of Europe and other parts of the world, we will get to those places, but not very soon. We know that it typically takes about a year to develop a new vaccine for a novel disease, and it probably takes several months to have effective antiviral sorts of medications or treatments. So when we think about this, although medicine, the field of medicine, has greatly improved over 100 years, there's a very, very significant part of the world that does not have access to that level of medical care, and those people get sick, of course, at a higher rate, but still have the availability and the ability to travel in which those parts of the world that are very sick are able to communicate that disease to other parts of the world. Again, they may have a very different medical posture. But pandemics are very different even than any other kind of disaster, never mind other sorts of diseases. Pandemics, by their nature, are predictably unpredictable. The virus has a tendency to change constantly, and our response, our social response, our governmental response is always being adapted and being changed as well. So when you see these big variations in models, where experts on the news are saying a week ago, or something like a week or two ago, that the expected number of dead in the U.S. from the pandemic would be anywhere from 100,000 to 240,000. That's been scaled down to something like 66,000 now. Why the huge variation? Because much about how a pandemic will unfold is actually unknowable. And the models are best guesses. The models are based on, really what's known as at the moment. It's based on world and global sorts of surveillance information. But we know that it's the nature of the disease to actually change and the nature of our response to change. So the other thing to know that's very important to us is that pandemics and this sort of public health emergency is super sensitive to human behavior, to communication, and to risk perception. So the what we say and the how we say and how we provide care to people, it actually is very different in this setting because of people's heightened level of sensitivity to all of our messaging and our care. The other thing that changes in this sort of emergency, and I know you're seeing this in your communities, and I live here in Sussex County myself with probably many of you, is that in most emergencies, we talk about frontline workers as being the traditional first responders, police, fire, EMS, folks like that, and even first receivers in our hospital emergency departments. But here, in something like a disease outbreak, you end up with a lot of non-traditional first responders who we just refer to as frontline responders or frontline workers. And they can include folks who are still working in our grocery stores, delivery people delivering those food, those meals and groceries, farmers who are still out trying to produce those foods and so forth, and even mental health workers as being those frontline workers in many of these settings. And obviously still our traditional first responders in the hospitals, healthcares, and EMS as well. So there's a lot of different exposure then to the behavioral challenges and stresses of this kind of disaster than there would be in something like a hurricane or a wildfire or other kind of emergencies. So let's spend a few moments talking about the unique behavioral health responses to pandemics. The reason for this discussion, again, is for us to help understand the normalcy of people's reactions. So as we engage them by phone and as we engage them by the web, we again can help normalize those reactions. The starting place for this discussion is Lewin's equation. Dr. Kurt Lewin is thought to be the father of social psychology, and Lewin had said that human behavior is a function of the interaction between the person and the environment. Now, we can't hope to know every person who's affected by a large-scale disease outbreak, but we can say with some degree of confidence what sort of environments bring about what sort of behaviors. And some of those behaviors make a lot of sense, like people who are scrambling to buy the last hand sanitizer or masks or wipes, disinfectant wipes, things of that nature. And some of it, like, hoarding toilet paper, doesn't make quite as much sense. But we don't see that sort of behavior in most disasters. Think about this. When the Weather Channel says we're about to have 4 inches of snow on a winter day, I know the line goes completely around the store for groceries, and people are primarily buying bread, milk, and eggs, things of that nature. So here's a very unique emergency in which people made this rush for something like toilet paper, paper towels, and so forth. So very, very unique sort of reactions to this sort of emergency. And one of the things that makes this very unique is what we refer to as dread. Now, if you have an interest in this sort of crisis work or disaster behavioral health, a book I'd recommend to you is Amanda Ripley's book, Unthinkable. Ripley's a Time magazine reporter, and she's focused most of her career working on really looking at human behavior and different sorts of crisis events and disasters. And as a construct, she said, dread, a word I know many of us use to just talk about fear or just, a very intense horror. She says dread is actually constructed of 7 different variables, and they all are present in the pandemic. The sense that it's uncontrollable, we're unable to stop it from spreading, totally unfamiliar to us. Most of us have never been alive during a disease outbreak like this. Unimaginable the numbers of people who have been affected, so large, scale of suffering and loss and unfairness. And the reason this is important is because when we have dread as an element of a disaster, dread actually amplifies or magnifies the traumatic nature of the event. So we actually get much higher levels of traumatic stress and other sorts of reactions when dread is part of the equation. And it certainly is during this sort of disease outbreak. But the other place that's really good to start is to think about how we react as communities to this sort of disaster compared to others. Now, the most common sort of reaction we see in the disaster, one emergency managers actually count on, we refer to as a type 1 response, or a neighbor helps neighbor response. So think about an event that happens all the time in North Jersey. We have serious storm blow through and some wires are down and some trees are down, and maybe one of your neighbors gets their house busted up by a tree that's fallen. And you feel terrible for your neighbor, so you want to go down there and help, and maybe even bake him a casserole and bring it down there for dinner that night. So that's the most common response. But now in a type 2 scenario, when we interject fear into the equation, fear starts to erode community cohesion. Community cohesion is actually the single greatest asset we have in a post-disaster environment. But now you have a legitimate concern that you can't go down the street to help out your neighbor if someone's home sick with a highly contagious disease, because you have to fear for your health, your family's health, your home's health. And this fear starts to prevent that natural altruistic helping response. And in the worst case situation, fear can become so acute that it actually creates a type 3 or neighbor competes with neighbor response. We saw that during Hurricane Sandy, where neighbors competed to get gasoline. We'll see it during this sort of emergency, in which people are competing to get the last toilet paper, the last hand sanitizer. In fact, most things that are in the stores, really flying off the shelf. Now that is panic. Panic is that competitive behavior in which people just start thinking about themselves. Panic is actually unlikely in most disasters, but it is more likely in a public health emergency. Most disasters have bookends. And what I mean by bookends is people can clearly start, see when the event starts, when it stops, and if you're in or out of the affected area. A really good example of this is a tornado. If you've ever been in the community affected by a tornado, one side of the street may look completely untouched and the other side may be completely just devastated. Most disasters by statistics are natural disasters. So most often we do have a bookends sort of event. In the bookend sort of event, what we get behaviorally in terms of an emotional response is a typical traumatic stress reaction. It's not necessary to say people go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, but traumatic stress reaction always has the same 3 hallmark features: arousal, avoidance, and re-experiencing. But when we have events that lack bookends, and they can be a disease outbreak, they can be something that's a chemical, biological, or radiological event, whether it's naturally occurring, accidental, or a terrorist event, we get a very, very different reaction that looks nothing like traumatic stress. It looks much more like this. What we see is a reaction that's much more somaticized, that people start developing these medically unexplained physical symptoms that are consistent with the illness or the injury of concern, but upon examination, they're not sick. Now, this is not psychosomatic. More technically, it's psychogenic, which means stress-induced. So you or someone you know may actually get hives when you're stressed. A person having hives isn't imagining them. You could see them, they could see them, but they're not necessarily sick. It's not part of a disease process. It's stress-related. The other thing we get that builds upon this is the possibility of mass sociogenic illness, sometimes in the literature referred to as epidemic hysteria. And this, rather than a medical contagion, is a psychological contagion in which such acute fear starts to spread through communities and organizations that it does start to manifest itself as these physical symptoms, and again convinces people that they're sick and everyone around them is sick. And this, of course, can trigger that panic. All of these things conspire with then a greater surge for healthcare seeking behavior. And these are more people showing up at the emergency department, at our testing sites, at their own doctor's offices, and so forth. And this last bullet is actually not a feature just of our current political environment or our current media environment, but we know in the literature and we know historically during events like this, there's a much greater distrust of public officials. All of these things conspire to create a very, very different environment in terms of the behavioral response to pandemics that doesn't look very much like other sorts of disasters or emergencies. The point of all of this so far was to say, if our approach to the public and our participants is primarily a psychoeducational approach, and the first step of the psychological or the psychoeducational approach is helping normalize reactions, it's very important for us to understand the normalcy of the reactions. But let me tell you just how powerful those could be. First, we have the potential for panic. Panic, as I said, that type 2 reaction, is unlikely in most disasters. Panic is competitive behavior that's driven by perception of limited opportunity for escape or perception of limited availability of critical supplies. Now, we have had some examples of people trying to escape this, to go to their country homes, their shore homes, to leave the state and go other places, and that hasn't always been well received by people in those locations. But more of what we've seen is perception of limited availability of critical supplies. So those are people cleaning out the shelves in the grocery stores, especially for things they think will be critical in this emergency. But to build on that, to give you more of a sense even of how psychologically powerful these events are, I want to reference two hallmark sorts of cases. The first was a terrorist attack in the Tokyo subway of March of '95 using sarin nerve gas. In this event, the group known as the Aum Shinrikyo, who perpetrated this event, released sarin nerve gas in the Tokyo subways during the morning commute. And this resulted in a 4-to-1 ratio of psychological casualties to medical casualties. And what that means in plain language is for every one person who runs to the emergency department, who runs to EMS for care, having gas exposure symptoms, 4 times that number also run for care, having the same symptoms, who have never been anywhere near this stuff. Again, not psychosomatic, psychogenic. But the most dramatic manifestation of this was actually in 1987 in Guiana, Brazil, when there was an accidental release of radiation, cesium-137. And that event resulted in a 500-to-1 ratio of psychological casualties to medical casualties. The Brazilian government ended up opening the Olympic soccer stadium as a radiation screening site. And in the first week of operations, sees 112,000 people who believe they've been exposed to radiation. Now, this is the most important part. Roughly out of the first 60,000 people who arrived for testing, about 5,000 have the signs and symptoms of acute radiation sickness, and not a single one of them had been exposed. So what does this do to our medical emergency capabilities, to our hospital surge capabilities? Obviously, it is potentially overwhelming. Now, panic is driven actually by economics. And economics here, we're not referring just to money or the stock market. By definition, economics is the allocation of scarce resources. And those could be masks and gloves and other forms of personal protective equipment or PPE. It could be those hand sanitizers and wipes and even cloth-based masks and things of this nature, right down to basic consumer goods like cases of water and cases of toilet paper. But we know this now creates a competitive environment that actually can pit neighbor against each other. And that can be even more damaging to our community. Now, the good news for us in more developed countries is that at some point, we start to have pharmaceutical options. Pharmaceutical options in the beginning usually start as antiviral medications, or perhaps in this instance, plasma treatments with antibodies to help people survive. Doesn't cure the disease, doesn't prevent the disease, aids in survivability. And then about a year in, we're usually able to have a viable vaccine to actually prevent or reduce the severity of the disease. But most places around the world actually never get to that place, and they stay where we are now. Where we are now, and where every country begins the beginning of a pandemic, is what we refer to as non-pharmaceutical options. And this is social distancing, closing schools and businesses, banning large gatherings, limiting travel, and for people where necessary, isolation and quarantine. So these all come at a social and a psychological consequence because people can't necessarily connect to their normal support systems, whether they're family, friends, and peers, whether they're social service agencies. All those things change and actually can deepen some of the psychological and social wounds associated with it. In the beginning, we don't have enough anything, and that certainly really contributes to the potential for panic. And this starts with even just basic floor space. Hospitals not having enough room. And in New York City, we saw the Navy ship in the harbor. Field hospitals stood up in Central Park, and the Javits Convention Center stood up as a COVID-19 hospital. But we don't have enough of anything in the beginning of an outbreak like that. So all of those shortages add to some of that panic and some of the some of the stress experienced by our communities. And we also have the possibility for aggression or violence, usually in places where the public interfaces with the healthcare system and where they may be turned away. Of someone who shows up at a testing site and says, no, you don't have the right sort of symptoms, we're not going to do the test. At some point, points of dispensing medication where only certain people will be getting medications in the beginning or vaccine in the beginning. And certainly hospital emergency departments who may not take people in because they simply can't or they don't have the right symptom profile. But there's all kinds of places where people can get more frustrated, more upset, and really potentially more aggressive. The primary driver of those flashpoints for aggression and violence is denial of access, when people are simply told no. No, you don't qualify for the medication, you don't qualify for a test, you can't have whatever it is they feel they need. And this could be something life or death, like access to a ventilator or access to a hospital room. But we also know we have then this kind of place where we start getting other flashpoints like perceived abridgment of civil rights, where people feel either the government hasn't done enough or the government is being too heavy-handed. And just this last week, we've started seeing protests of people who are pushing back against social distancing. Here, just a few days ago, armed protesters on the Capitol of the steps of the Capitol building in Lansing, Michigan, wanting the governor to change the position on social distancing and the closure of businesses. So here, an already polarized nation around different viewpoints can become more polarized around the government's response, meaning what the government has done or hasn't yet done and people's perception about that. So this becomes a very, very tricky environment. And I want to give you just a quick snapshot of how we kind of look at this going out over a timeline. Now, the first thing to notice, and you may see it in small print to the side of this graphic, is we actually created this pandemic map way back in 2006. And way back in that time frame, I actually worked with SAMHSA and helped SAMHSA develop their pandemic plans and their pandemic tabletop exercises in Washington. And we tried to help leaders identify where we would be more likely to see different behavioral health challenges or emotional reactions. We, right now, are on the front side of the first wave of this pandemic. Pandemics typically occur in 2 to 3 waves. There tends to be a few weeks or months between the waves, but overall it usually takes between a year and 18 months for the event to be completely exhausted. In the first wave, on the front side is where we're most likely to see fear, anxiety, stress, and panic, because we simply don't have enough of anything. The disease is brand new. People don't understand it. They're getting a lot of mixed messages about it. There's not enough of anything. whether it's from toilet paper to ventilators and hospital beds. Really, this is where we're experiencing the most death and illness because we don't have vaccine and we don't have medications just yet. So this is really the worst part of it, is the front side of the first wave. Now, before we go further along this graphic, notice that the vertical axis here is not the number of casualties. It's not the number of sick and dead. It is the level of disruption in society. And it's been very disruptive so far. But once we hit the peak, and some authorities think we've hit the peak here in the New York, New Jersey area already, and we may start to slowly see our numbers daily coming down over time. Doesn't stop immediately, but it starts to work its way down. What we see on the back side of the first wave is very different. And this is where we tend to see traditional traumatic stress reactions, grief, loss, anger, depression, and much more of the typical reactions that we see in other sorts of disasters is what we see during the second wave. So as you're thinking about how we best serve our community in the wake of this crisis, understand that the psychological response and people's needs is going to change greatly over time. Now, I've heard a few people make the analogy or comparison to us getting through a pandemic as running a marathon rather than running a sprint. And we need to pace ourselves and we need to think about the long distance challenges. And I wouldn't disagree with that. That's all accurate. But more appropriately, I think rather than thinking about this as running, I think about this as surfing. Because the nature of each wave tends to change, we have to be very fluid and very adaptable to the unique emotional challenges on all of the waves. And it will be different in the second wave, and it will be different potentially in the third wave. But we're at the peak now where you're about to see something very different change, where the reaction is going to be about people taking inventory, about people who have been lost, about people who have been badly sickened and injured by this illness, about losses of all different types, and those could be economic losses and losses of jobs or financial security. And this is where we're more likely to have a typical traumatic stress reaction. So the organizations and the leaders of those organizations that do the best in the pandemic are people who are the quickest and the best at adapting and communicating. Adapting and communicating will be the two primary skills and two primary challenges for all organizations to survive this event. It continues to change, information changes, the disease changes, and our reactions, both of our staff and our community, continue to change in each wave. Obviously, in an event that lasts 12 months to a year, there's also an exhausting quality to this as well. So let's talk a little bit about the social impact of this as we go on. First of all, I'm not going to read each of the smaller bullets because in some ways we've spoken about each of those, but at a high level, obviously this affects people's livelihoods. Some people have been laid off or furloughed. Some businesses are closed. Some businesses already will be gone for good and not reopening. And some sectors of our economy, travel and entertainment and sporting and sports events and all those things are going to be closed for a good long time. And there's going to be tremendous economic impacts. So those are at the job level. Human health, obviously, very high levels of illness and potential death rates. We're seeing that. We've seen some tragic things here in our own community in Sussex County as well. Overstretched healthcare facilities speaks for itself. And like many emergencies and disasters, there's a disproportionate impact on vulnerable people and vulnerable populations. From a government standpoint, you have both dynamics happening simultaneously. Why is the government not doing enough, and why is the government doing too much? And those may, again, coexist, because as we're struggling to reduce the impact of the illness, we know all of our systems are over capacity. All of our systems are overwhelmed. At the social and humanitarian level, we also know that our normal support systems are badly disrupted. As I said, family, friends, peers, coworkers, we're seeing each other perhaps now in things like Zoom meetings, but of course not all of our population has access to these sorts of technologies, and they're also not quite the same. We also know that there's a social cost to public health policy involving things like quarantine and isolation. And lastly, in the economic range, from the macroeconomics of the stock market to the microeconomics of your bank account, we know this is very, very devastating, and it's affecting the entire global market. So a lot of these social impacts are about a loss of control. There are loss of income and autonomy, of certain civil liberties being taken from us, maybe necessarily so. But also, we could have losses of all levels. They're not necessarily just losses of loved ones. They could be losses of, again, even beliefs, such as our belief in the government, in our medical system, in humankind, and some of our religious values or patriotic values as well. Culture plays a huge role in how people perceive things like disease outbreaks and governmental responses to them. So depending on cultures that people come from, there may be very different views about the government, different views about the mental health care or medical system, very different feelings about things like burial rituals and funeral rituals and so forth. And a lot of fears among undocumented people who may be fearful about coming forward for fear of immigration consequences. So all sorts of behavioral challenges around culture. And then we said very quickly, without going into great depth, we see just the impact on the world economy of the workforce being disrupted, of supply chains being disrupted, of some sectors being completely wiped out. And simultaneously right now, although you and I may think about it as somewhat of a bonus that gas prices have come down today, remember today is April 20th, 2020, oil prices hit $12 a barrel, which is the lowest it's been in decades. So the oil market is greatly disrupted by what's happening and a few other things that affect that. That's also very destabilizing to the whole global economy. And personal finances also somewhat speak for themselves, and we're all getting this. If people are losing pay, if they're not being paid, hourly workers who are not working at all, certainly are bringing in no money, and then on top of that, they may deplete it whatever savings they may have had or start relying on credit cards for all kinds of expensive. You can imagine then, and I think the number was something like a third of all Americans did not make their April 1st rent payments on time. So this is devastating at the personal finance level as well. And then our most vulnerable populations become that much more vulnerable. When we think about the risk of abuse, it actually escalates in this sort of crisis because of what we refer to as the triangle of crime. The crime triangle assumes three main features have to be in place for abuse or victimization to occur. The first is the presence of a likely offender. Well, in cases of domestic violence, of cases of child abuse, of elder abuse, that offender may be home a lot more than they used to be home if their business is closed, if they've been laid off, or they're working from home. Same thing, the proximity of a suitable target. People are now stuck in homes perhaps with abusers and under increased different sorts of stresses, financial and otherwise. And then on top of that, the last variable is the absence of capable guardians. Now, capable guardians in most senses might be police and other authorities. It may be protection agencies, child protection agencies, domestic violence agencies, and so forth. But this also means folks like classroom teachers who are not seeing those students, or a school bus driver who's not seeing that student and may see signs of abuse. It may be the neighbor who's not seeing an elder who's shut in because people are social distancing and not going out. All sorts of victims or potential victims of violence may be much more isolated and stuck in those places where now they can't, escape in ways they normally would. The person who might have gone to stay with family and friends during instances of abuse perhaps can't do that now for fear of infecting others, perhaps our shelters being overfilled and so forth. And again, we said being trapped in homes with abusers during times of increased stress in those households really changes this equation. So in instances of domestic violence and instances of child abuse, elder abuse, and other sorts of victimization, we know that the rates of those and the likelihood of those situations actually increases over time. And so many things contribute to that. I'm not, as I said, going to belabor this, But because people, again, are isolated in a time of increased stress in potentially abusive environments, the risk obviously increases. There's a few other risks in which children may be at home and parents may be working from home. And although they're both home, that parent may be giving almost no attention to a younger child who now is in a house all of a sudden that's filled and, with disinfectants and cleaners and sanitizers being left on every tabletop. And being even a health risk or poisoning risk there as well. So this is a very, very tricky environment for vulnerable populations in general, but especially those who are likely targets of different sorts of abuses. Now, when we think of all of the different sorts of populations that we serve, all different sorts of vulnerable people, we know there's a number of things that go on in these disease outbreaks that change the equation and increase stress on them as well. And they could be things like travel restrictions in which people can't come out and get services. We can't deliver services in the same way. Services that may have been things like group sessions aren't happening, but also the supply chain, both around medicines, medications, and illegal substances. Those supply chains could be disrupted or just dry up. And then at the staffing level, we have a push-pull sort of dynamic. And what I mean by that is we have decreased levels of staffing because some of our staff are sick, some of our staff are home on quarantine, or home with other loved ones who may be sick on quarantine, or with children who are now home. And because we have that, during a time of decreased staffing, we're also potentially having increased levels for demand for services. So it's very, very tricky that we are being pulled thinner than ever during this sort of situation. Now, for individuals who are already, kind of challenged with different substance abuse problems and disorders, we know that under most disaster situations, we actually see increased levels of substance abuse. The thing to know is out of the large potential increase in substance abuse, the vast majority, and what I mean here is like 98 to 99%, is relapse and recidivism. It is not new users. So we've already seen some very creative use of things from Zoom to FaceTime and other technologies to help people conduct AA and NA meetings and keep that sort of peer support and social support going, which is so important in recovery. But we also know there could be challenges in medication-assisted opioid treatment, challenges around normal peer support, and we know that even the street drugs start to dry up. Of course, it could be challenges in getting medication-assisted supplies like Suboxone or methadone, but for the person who is drug dependent, the drugs that are actually on the street can dry up as well. And that brings in other sorts of problems like price gouging, tampered or contaminated substances, which can keep people very, very sick or deadly, and competition or even criminal activity to access the last of those substances can increase as well. So what you see in a public health emergency is a very, very tricky landscape where all these things all these sorts of problems can be potentially magnified. Now, I'm making some assumptions on the next several slides that in an audience that's largely social service and human service workers, that when I discuss the physical, emotional, behavioral, and spiritual, existential impacts of an event like this, you already have a pretty good sense of the type of thing I'm thinking about. So say, for example, in the physical domain, people could feel very wired and anxious and stressed. This could elevate heart rate and blood pressure. It could change sleeping patterns and change appetite and eating patterns and such. All of those kind of things. So I'm not going to belabor these, but I will tell you at the end of the program, when we're all done, I'm sending your agency leaders the recording, the slides, and it's called a Handout for Survivors, which is from the Psychological First Aid Field Operations Guide and has very, very good tips for coping. And on those tips, it talks about what we refer to as positive and negative coping. It also talks about the way people are impacted in these physical, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral domains. So you will have some information available at your fingertips to learn more about this as we go. The other thing we know is that grief and loss can be very, very powerful and destabilizing during large-scale health emergencies as well. Not being able to see a loved one and say goodbye, the way that bodies may be handled or stored, the way that funeral rituals may be disrupted, all are very, very challenging for people and complicate grief and bereavement. I don't need to talk to any of us in the county right now about recent events, but obviously we have a very powerful example of that that's happened over the past several days right here in Sussex County. Beyond that, remember that grief is our reaction to loss in general, not just loss of a loved one. So we can have people having grief reactions to all other kinds of losses as well. And that could be around financial security or losing a business, just simply losing our beliefs in some ways, or even the loss of just general human connection. And all these, again, get even more complicated by the cumulative nature of how many people are sick and how many people potentially die of this event. They can lead to very serious feelings of powerlessness. They can leave us in a very, very tricky situation in terms of just waves of grief and waves of loss. Now, this is something I think is interesting. I mentioned I've worked with SAMHSA in Washington, D.C. for many, many years. And SAMHSA actually had predicted, going back about 6 years ago, that by 2020, mental health disorders and substance abuse disorders would outpace all other forms of disability worldwide. So we are actually at that point in the trajectory and trends of mental health and substance abuse disorders at the exact time that we have this global health crisis. So this is really a very tricky perfect storm scenario of the collision of these two trends, an increase in mental health and substance abuse issues and combining with a global disease outbreak. Now, obviously, one thing I want to point out is that most individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions, and right now that's somewhere between about 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 Americans, individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions do not necessarily deteriorate or decompensate just because of the shock and awe of the disease. What tends to lead to deterioration in their condition is disruption. Disruption of medication, supports, and services. So if you come into a major health crisis like this with a pre-existing condition, depending on that condition, it may be greatly exacerbated, but some conditions are not so reactive. If you come into a public health emergency with a pre-existing anxiety disorder, obviously that's likely to be greatly exacerbated by the idea that there are germs all around us, there's a virus going on that we can't see, smell, hear, or taste that may affect us, that may get us sick and may in fact kill us. If you have a specific type of anxiety disorder, for example, obsessive compulsive disorder, obviously that could be made much worse by this sort of situation as well. And lastly, some thought disorders may be exacerbated by this as well, and specifically something like schizophrenia. Interesting as an aside, some disorders we think, just instinctively think might be exacerbated by a disease outbreak or not. PTSD, for example, at least in the first wave of the first part of the disease, is not that affected. Bipolar disorder, not that affected in the first phase of the first wave, maybe more so in the later sorts of phases of this disease. But as I mentioned, what tends to impact our consumers, impact our program participants, more than anything is disruption in services, supports, and meds. And the way around this is good continuity of operations plans where they're possible to have ways to resume services in some part to try to bridge that gap when they become disrupted from a disease. So if our assessment or assumption rather is that most of the communications that we have with folks will be by phone and will be by web, there's a few things we should talk about how we communicate with people under high stress that should inform your approach and your style to communicating. And to start with, the idea is that, obviously stress is normal, and each of us has a little bit of our own tolerance or tipping point around stress. But we know for each of us, regardless of how resilient we are to the daily stresses that, are kind of necessary in life, we can reach a tipping point where really it starts to degrade our performance and other people around us. Now, this model goes back more than 100 years. It's known as the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And here, the original psychologists who developed it noticed that some stress seemed to be necessary in life to really get us in an optimal zone of operation where we're really interested, we're really engaged, we're really, really doing the best at our job tasks and being most effective in life. But that for each of us, there tends to be a tipping point, a point of diminishing returns, that once we pass that, our performance starts to fall off at a time when we actually need to be our best. So we could actually somewhat become very immobilized by our own level of fear and stress and anxiety. Now, as I said, this is different for each person, and it's different for people in different sort of crisis situations. We also know that a lot of us work day to day in very stressful environments and have a pretty good tolerance for stress. But for each of us, there is a tipping point where this starts to work against us. And when it does, we know we start to see changes both at the physiological level and, of course, at a emotional and mental health level. And what does that look like as we start to see performance fall away? Well, it's really diminishing problem solving, decision making, logic, judgment, reasoning, impulse control, and even verbal processing. And you'll notice verbal processing here in bold, underlined, because that's where we're going. How do we talk to people under levels of acute stress? All of these functions listed above obviously are critical to helping people function during a crisis. So there's parts of our brain and body that are working against us, and much less activation of the frontal part of the brain, that thinking, executive function part of the brain, and much more activity in the doing part of the brain. And that's the brain stem that regulates all of our vital signs, heart rate, blood pressure, and so forth, but also the limbic system, which is the emotional brain, that kind of center of our emotional life in our brain. Now, one of the theories that explains this well is known as the mental noise theory. What mental noise theory says is when people are really overwhelmed, overloaded with fear, stress, and information, it starts to degrade their ability to take in new information. Now, this is going to be important to us as we talk about how to help people cope in the next few moments. And one of the things mental noise theory says is under acute stress, people receive, process, remember, and act on information differently. Potentially, their ability to act on new information is decreased by 80%. So what we understand then as kind of caregivers is that people's ability to take on new information and new ideas may be greatly reduced, and we have to be increasingly patient and persistent in helping people. The other thing we know is under acute stress and fear, people are much, much more sensitive to nonverbal communication, and they tend to judge the messenger before they judge the message, which means they're listening for that connection with you in terms of being sincere and genuine and being credible. And we know that their perception of you, and this is true in normal therapeutic relationships as well, not just during disasters and emergencies, is very much about our ability to really empathically connect with people. So we want to make sure we're coming across as being that warm, receptive, genuine, responsive person on the phone and by web. One of the other things we know is the more fearful a situation is, the more we have to lead with empathy. And I honestly mean leading where the initial comments and initial responses we make to people by phone and web focus on the emotions rather than the facts about the disease. Now, this is tricky because the first part of any disaster or crisis is typically what we refer to as an information-seeking phase, where people just want the facts. And our natural tendency is to want to reply to people by just giving them the facts. First of all, it's important for each of us to remember to stay in our lane. If you're not a public health worker, if you are not a medical person, we should not be the source of giving people the medical information about COVID-19. We should be referring those calls to New Jersey's public health department, the county public health department, different medical helplines, and so forth. We should make sure we're staying in our lane. And our lane is to help people to cope with the stresses of the situation so they could best meet the challenges ahead. As I said, as we engage people, it's important to start then with messages that let them know we hear how frightened they are, we can appreciate how upsetting their situation is, but our focus in our field is to help people cope with these challenges. Now, interesting, one of our very best risk communicators here in the US, Dr. Peter Sandman, has for decades used this expression, action binds anxiety. Giving people practical things to do is a great way to focus some of that energy, some of that excitement, and give them tasks that help ground all of that free-floating environment, or excuse me, free-floating anxiety. So in our messages, yes, our messages need to be clear. You have to be prepared to repeat yourself without getting frustrated. We know short-term and working memory suffer under acute stress. We again have to focus on being empathetic, but also giving people things to do. Take care during disasters and emergencies that we don't allow people to get more dependent on us, because we may not always be available, or the next wave of the disease may be even more disruptive. So we want this to be an empowerment sort of approach where we're teaching people, helping people learn to do for themselves. Now, I did not mention social media before, and I also said very clearly, we're the very first generation of workers having to go through something of this nature in a public or a social media environment. Social media obviously could be a two-edged sword, that we could use it to push out very good and important information, but those same social media channels, as well as traditional media channels, may be giving people information that's not helpful. So social media here is not the cause of a lot of the problems, but certainly can be contributing to some of the problems in terms of elevating people's fear and stress. So we think about social media acting potentially as a force multiplier, as people could tweet and retweet and share posts and repost things. The numbers of people exposed to those messages grows exponentially. Social media also accelerates, good information as well as bad information. There was a time not too long ago, people came home from work, flipped on the 6 o'clock news, and they got their news once a day. Our news is coming to us all day long in multiple formats on multiple devices, and again, can be somewhat overwhelming for people. I'm going to talk about that as a strategy in just a moment. So when we start to think a little bit about some of how people process information differently in high fear, high stress situations, hopefully that informs a little bit about your style and your approach in communicating with people during a high stress environment. So whether it's by phone, social media, or in those instances where we could start to resume face-to-face, support for people, it's important to have a few ideas about how we can adjust our basic approaches and techniques to assisting people during this public health emergency. And one of the core messages is, just as there's not one single way that people react, or a correct way that people react to a health emergency, there's not one single best way to cope either. In fact, most of the coping that works best is coping people experiment with until they find things that are most successful. So although I don't have a slide about this, I'd like to introduce you to a very simple model that's known as the 3 A's. And the 3 A's are adopt, adapt, and apply. And what we mean by adopt is maybe teaching people, and this could be by phone or internet and so forth, different coping strategies. And that could be something like a breathing exercise, or another relaxation exercise, or some other technique that may be effective in coping. But the reason I have this model of the 3 A's, the second A is adapt. We know that some people under stress are not in a great place to learn a lot of new information or new techniques. So the question in adapt is, what has helped you in other parts of your life? What strategies or techniques have you used when you've been coped in others, been stressed rather, in other situations? And can you modify that or adapt it to this challenge? It's much easier for people to fall back to strategies and techniques they know and they're familiar with than invent or learn new ones in the face of a crisis. So adopt is new information, adapt is modifying existing ways of coping, and apply, the third A, is the invitation to go give it a try. We don't want people immobilized by fear and stress. We don't want them just stuck in their heads where they're ruminating and spiraling with this fear about all the terrible things that they're hearing, they're seeing, or what's going to happen next. So we know that people get through these challenges in their own time and on their own terms. But very often when they're in the middle of this crisis, it can be hard for them to really be creative and think about the best way to approach it. And that's where you and I can be a great asset to them, this idea of assisted coping. Not doing for them, but doing with them. So the first place to think about how people get a grip on fear and stress is to know that the first phase is usually an information-seeking phase. Let's make sure we connect them with the proper sources of information. Now, these are our governmental, county, our state, our national health authorities like the CDC, or even international authorities like the World Health Organization. There's a lot of good information that's out there. Most of it's credible and most of it's solid. But part of this is the volume of information that people are getting. And in the beginning of a crisis like this, most people are actually getting their information much more like from a fire hose than a garden hose. It's coming at us so fast and so strong, it could actually be overwhelming for people. It can knock them right off their feet. So a strategy is to help people start to curate and start to really reduce that stream of information to make sure it's credible, but it's also manageable. Now, this is a trick because now most of us have a device, 2 or even 3 devices on us at any time in which we're getting information, just coming at us. So part of the strategy is experimenting with people, or have them at least experiment with cutting back on how much news they're getting throughout the day. Can you check your phone once an hour? Can you check it twice a day? Can you start to structure that so you're simply not being bombarded and overwhelmed with the volume or the diversity of information that's coming at us? And this is that shift from a fire hose to a garden hose. So whether it's taking a break altogether, or it is, kind of, as I said, modifying or regulating how much information they're taking in, this is another way to give people some sense of control. One of the other challenges for coping is actually remaining connected with other people in any way they can. Disease outbreaks almost universally require some level of physical distance or social distancing. And I used the phrase earlier, social distancing does not have to be the same as social isolation. We know that isolation has a mental health cost. We know that vulnerable people may be become more vulnerable or more stressed in times when they're broken away from their network. So social isolation becomes, or social distancing actually becomes, a bigger risk factor for them as well. So talking to all those people they trust, friends, family, peers, support personnel from our organization agencies, mental health and medical health professionals, clergy, whoever they really find as a source of help in their life, we want them reaching out to those people. And we want people to whatever degree possible to stay busy, both physically and mentally. Even for folks who are on quarantine, they can safely go outside and go for a walk. They need to be properly protected. They need to keep, social distance from folks, but we can still be physically busy during times of physical isolation. Keeping ourselves physically and mentally busy is important beyond what I can share with you, because once again, people start ruminating, it magnifies the mental health impact. So whether it's by Zoom, FaceTime, simple texting, or cell phone calls or other phone calls, the more people can have contact, with each other, the more protective that contact becomes. I know, and that there's generational gaps around some of these technologies. There are people of a certain age, there are people in different socioeconomic brackets who don't have access to or familiarity with these technologies. So it may be a job for us to help them brainstorm and think about other ways to stay connected with people, even though they can't physically see them. Callers and people we engage on the phone or web may be asking questions about, how do I help others in my home? It's not about me. And I want to give you 2 quick messages about this, and then talk a little bit about helping children in the home. If you don't know this already, and I'm thinking this is pretty common knowledge, The single greatest variable that's going to affect how children do during a crisis is how parents and caregivers do during that crisis. So on a call, someone may say to us, I'm not worried about me. I'm doing fine. I just want to know how to take care of the kids. A very important message is, sir, ma'am, whoever, please understand one of the most important influences on how your children will do during the crisis is how you do. So while your focus is on your children, and that's certainly admirable, it's important to also have a focus on your physical and your emotional wellness in order to take care of each other. Now, obviously, I'm preaching to the choir, and I'm hoping we're applying some of those messages to ourselves. But the model for helping people in our home is simply referred to as supportive acknowledgement, letting people know we hear them, we get it, we appreciate their concerns, that they're valid to us in a calm and empathetic way. We don't want to discount them. We don't want to feel that they're not heard, or we think they're overreacting. When people feel either that we don't care or we don't get it, there's a tendency to turn up the intensity of their reaction or the volume of their communication in ways that get even more unproductive. With children, obviously, we need to speak to them in age-appropriate and developmentally appropriate ways. But it's important to be transparent, because children will obviously know a tremendous change in others in their home and tremendous change in their routines and their lives. So in ways that are appropriate, speak to them about the crisis, reassure them, be kind, be gentle, be reassuring, and understand young children may even regress a little bit and need more attention. Now that sounds very intuitive and natural, unless you're that very stressed out parent who's now also trying to work at home while doing classroom work for your child at home, while dealing with the fact that, we have this tremendously frightening situation and your home economy may be greatly out of whack. Important to build routine back into children's lives. And I know that sounds like almost a cliche, but routine, and it may not be your old routine, it may be important to develop a new routine. Routine builds predictability into the day and into life. And that is so important in a crisis that is characterized by nothing but uncertainty. So in all the ways that parents can, try to maintain connection and closeness with people of all ages in the home. Try to be reassuring, try to be transparent in appropriate ways, and try to create new routines. If children and parents have to be separated, children and caregivers have to be separated because of hospitalization, if there are ways to maintain connections through the use of these technologies, that would be a wonderful thing to do. As I said, bring kids into the loop, talk about things that they could do to be part of the solution. And that's good hygiene and washing, good disinfecting, good distancing, all of those things. Make children feel that they're part of the solution, and certainly not be made to feel that they're a greater part of the problem. A cognitive behavioral technique may be appropriate for some callers, simply referred to as temporal distancing. And that's the idea of almost a thought exercise of asking the caller to imagine how this emergency will look in the rearview mirror, how they will think about it a year later. What was the most difficult part? What were they most successful at doing? What did they learn and how did they grow during this challenge? All may be good things to kind of talk them through as a way of creating some mental distance and taking them out of this fearful moment. And that's something they could do themselves as well as you. And certainly, very, very basic, and here, not, of course, calling the PA Department of Health, but for us, the New Jersey Department of Health, connect people again to those right kind of resources, CDC, World Health Organization, county and state health, and control the things they can control, like washing. Now, I'm not going to belabor this, but there's very good instructions online and very good apps available for simple breathing techniques. There's a lot of different relaxation techniques for adults and kids that are referred to as autogenic techniques. Autogenic techniques are techniques that trigger the sympathetic, or rather the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your relaxation response. And your relaxation response is actually more powerful than your fight and flight response and can start to restore some sense of calmness and control to that individual. These are usually very easy to learn, easy to practice, and easy to employ when people are feeling stressed. but it's another place where people can do some learning and try some new techniques. An important message for all of us is giving people permission to both ask for help and accept help when it's offered to them. We know there's a lot of barrier around giving and seeking social support. People could feel that they don't want to be perceived as weak. They don't want to burden other people during a time of crisis. They don't want to feel weak themselves. There's all sorts of reasons why people, again, really, again, avoid reaching out and avoid both getting and giving the support that's so necessary. So this is a really powerful message as we engage people on the phone to make sure that they're both asking and accepting help from others. It's also very therapeutic for them to be giving that help. So a few ideas in providing support from help, and then a few closing thoughts about taking care of yourself during this challenge. Obviously, basic good phone skills, soft tone, welcoming, sound enthusiastic, sound, again, optimistic without sugarcoating the situation, and certainly be flexible to adjust to person's pacing, their needs, in terms of any different sorts of functional needs, and also cultural differences as well. Be a good listener. Don't feel that you need to have the answers to all the problems. Remember, you're not there to fix the individual's problem. You're there to help them cope with the stresses of this so they can better fix those problems and handle their challenges themselves. We're not the source of medical information, but know how to connect them with that information. We, again, can be there to assist in their coping, but hopefully not coping for them. Try to be non-judgmental, even if there's something they're saying or doing that you don't agree with. We don't want to, again, have them come across as feeling that they're ineffective or they're doing this the wrong way. But if you're hearing kind of ineffective coping or negative coping in plain language means things that aren't helping, they're unhelpful. We can introduce other alternatives. Here's some other options. Here's some other things that people have found helpful, and introduce those as well. And try to use I statements. I statements personalize the conversation. I can hear how upset you are. I can hear in your voice that you're worried. Those sort of statements where you're not coming across as I'm speaking on behalf of the agency, I'm speaking on behalf of the county health department. No, I'm speaking person to person in a time when we are all separated from each other, and that's very frightening. I want to know, I hear you, I'm concerned about you, and I'm here to help. Important messages. Address thoughts and feelings. Use those good active listening techniques like paraphrasing, repeating back to people, reflective listening techniques. But avoid outright giving advice. You should or you shouldn't. Brainstorm with people. What's working for others, how they may adapt those skills. Let me introduce some new ideas to you. So if you keep coping messages, one, normalizing their distress. Given the seriousness of this event, it's totally normal. In fact, you may be familiar with this expression, normal reactions to abnormal events. Totally understandable. The feelings you're having, the stress you're experiencing, the anger that you have about the situation. When I talk about gathering information in bullet point number 2 here, I'm not talking about pushing people about the depth of their thoughts and their feelings and their emotions. For most instances, the individuals we're talking to are probably not your patients. You may not be like in a therapeutic relationship with them. So we're not in a therapy session. Psychotherapy is intended to help people create change in their life. Change in thoughts and moods, behaviors, relationships, communication. People come to therapy to change. The last thing people need in the midst of a tremendous crisis is more change. The point of our support and intervention is actually to help prevent change and get people back to baseline levels of functioning as quickly as possible. And we know in the research in this area that people who get back to baseline the fastest do best in the long-term recovery. So encourage them to get back to baselines in terms of lifestyle and diet and sleep and routine and social contacts, all those things as much as they can safely using the different resources that are available to them, technologies and otherwise. Reassure, again, callers that this is frightening for everyone. They can manage that perhaps better by that switch from fire hose to garden hose, by tailoring how much media they're absorbing, by building upon existing skills and techniques they have that have used them coping before. And number 7, trying to avoid some of the negative coping behavior like increasing drugs, alcohol, and other things that actually may make their situation worse. So I want to finish in 2 ways. One, a general finish, and then some real focus points about you, participants on the call, taking care of yourself during this crisis. Some basic do's and don'ts: help people meet their own basic needs for food, shelter, medical attention, emotional support as necessary. Remember, we want to get people doing for themselves where they can, help them feel not so mobilized. And be prepared to repeat these, sorts of guidances and tips without getting frustrated. Remember that short-term memory and working memory can be gravely affected under this kind of stress. Project a calmness. We're not telling other people to be calm. That's usually not a good story. But by us projecting a calmness can influence the other person to be calm themselves. Even with people being difficult, angry, upset, try to remain your composure, try to remain your calmness, and project that optimism, that calmness in your communication. And as I mentioned a few times, promote that self-efficacy of people doing for themselves rather than becoming so dependent during the crisis. Lastly, promote hope. Without sugarcoating the situation, understand everything people are hearing and seeing about this can be overwhelming and terrifying. We could be that positive voice. Pandemics are time limited. This too will pass, as difficult and challenging as it will be. This is not the way life will be forever here or around the world. But we have a very, very challenging situation that's going to require us working together and working as effectively as we can. 1 or 2 don'ts: don't force people to talk about things they're not ready for, they can't. We're not in that therapeutic sort of environment. We don't have that sort of therapeutic rapport, and we're not there to break down or challenge their defenses. Don't give simple reassurances, as we said, and don't be telling people in the prescriptive way what they should think or feel. And certainly don't allude that they have been responsible for their own suffering. Well, if you had prepared better, if you have done this or you had done that, obviously just deepens the wounds. Likewise, don't make promises that can't be kept. From there, lastly, I'm going to ask you, please, not to criticize the existing relief efforts. If you have even legitimate or very powerful complaints about the way the whole situation has been handled, I get that, I understand it, and I would encourage you to talk about it. Talk about it with your friends, with your family, with coworkers, but not with the public we're serving by phone. And I'm not asking you to give them the company line, but remain neutral. We are all adapting to the challenges and trying our very best. So summary and conclusion: I see one of our participants has a hand up. We'll try to get to questions and all that in just a moment. A few things to think about in closing. In general, in disaster behavioral health, we talk about these concepts that the human response to challenges like this is both phase-specific and hazard-specific. Phase-specific: this will continue to change not only wave by wave, but whether we're on the front or the back side of the wave. And hazard-specific means we don't react the same way to fire, flood, and earthquake as we do to a shooting event, as we do to a disease outbreak. This reaction is going to be very specific to health emergencies. Remember that health emergencies that lack bookends, any sort of emergency that doesn't have that clear start, that clear stop when we're in or out, actually is likely to present much more somatic reactions, much more anxiety, and it's a much more lasting behavioral response. Be truthful and connect people to good sources of information so they can be making decisions for themselves, and try to guide them towards things they could actually do rather than being immobilized by stress. But my last message is to you, or understand by asking people to share with us their emotional challenges, what's going on in their life, what they've lost, and how it's affecting them. This is going to take a toll on us as well. Whether it's the cumulative effect of one story more difficult or sad than the other, by the level of people's depth of grief or anger or frustration, by over-identifying with people who are calling us, because these are our friends and neighbors and our program participants who we know, or simply by us having potentially an unrealistic expectation of being able to relieve all of their emotional pain. This can have a wear and tear on us. Many of you know, as a very simple analogy, secondary traumatic stress. If we think about secondhand smoke, you're not the smoker, but maybe you're breathing other people's smoke and it's having an ill effect on us. Secondary traumatic stress, you're not the traumatized person, but having exposure to their trauma and pain can have a real effect on us. It's unrealistic to think that you could walk into the water without getting wet. If we immerse ourselves in other people's pain and suffering, it is going to splash up on us. It is going to affect us, and we have to be prepared to take care of each other and take care of ourselves. So I'm going to close today with a quote from Nietzsche, and I'll paraphrase Nietzsche's quote, who said, in the process of fighting monsters, take care that we do not become monsters. There's a second part of that quote in which he says, remember that when we look into the dark abyss, the abyss looks back at us. Folks, for everyone who is on this call, thank you so much for your interest. Thank you for all you're doing in this emergency. And please make sure you're also taking care of yourself and taking care of each other. Know that we do have a good mental health helpline that's operational 7 days a week from 8A to 8P. Remember, you're getting a copy of these slides, so you will have these numbers and everything else I've shared with you today. And remember, you're also getting a link to the video, so you can go back to it or share it with others as well. So I want to close by thanking you very much for all of your time and attention to the program. I'm going to open the Q&A window. And there was an attendee who had a hand raised. If that was a question or anything, any of us now, if you'd like to use the question and answer period, you can go ahead and do that. But I'm actually going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point, so we're free to just talk.